Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us in this event today. My name is Maria Virginia Olano. I am editorial and research associate at Canary Media. If you don't know us, we're an independent nonprofit media outlet that covers clean energy and the solutions to the climate crises. If you're interested in following a little bit more of our work, you can go to our website, canarymedia.com. You can also sign up to our newsletter so you never miss a story. Before we get started, a couple reminders. This conversation will be recorded, so you can watch on demand in our site. And we're also wanting to answer audience questions. So if you go to the Q&A bar, please add your questions there. We'll try to get to them. And you can also upvote other people's questions if you like them. So climate tech is a growing sector. It's growing at unprecedented speed. According to Climatetech Venture Capital, climate tech companies raised $40 billion in 2022, and the Inflation Reduction Act has guaranteed $370 billion in climate spending over the next 10 years. These companies are among the fastest growing employers in the US. By some estimates, they're expected to create 9 million jobs in the coming decade. And yet, women, and specifically women of color, continue to be underrepresented in the workforce. The gender pay gap is a persistent challenge, and more women are leaving the workforce. All of these are big challenges as the sector continues to expand and grow. And since Canary Media started nearly 2 years ago in April, we've published a column that tracks women's career moves in climate and clean energy. That column is called Charging Up. It features short conversations with industry leaders to learn about their careers and the lessons they've learned along the way. Today, we're joined by 3 of those leaders that have come together to have a more in-depth conversation with all of you. I am so lucky and excited to be moderating this panel, and we're going to be discussing the most exciting employment opportunities, the persistent challenges in building a diverse workforce, and practical advice for anyone looking to navigate a career in climate tech. So without further ado, let's turn to our panel. Super grateful to be joined by Julie Blunden. She is Chief Operating Officer at Plus Power, Amy Dufour, who is General Partner at Azola Ventures, and Lauren Densham, who is Head of Impact and ESG at Energize Ventures. Why don't we go around and introduce yourselves? I know you all have very, very long and impressive resumes, and we'd love to hear some about that. So why don't you kick us off, Julie?
Sure. So at Plus Power, we are developing, owning, and operating grid-scale energy storage facilities across the United States. Over half the states we're developing in, over 8 gigawatts, multiple hours. We're growing really fast. We're an literal poster child for what's happening in the market right now, and what just happened with the IRA last year put us into overdrive, and in fact was the reason that I moved from an advisory board position. I thought I was semi-retired, back in-house as an executive, because this is an all hands on deck moment. So when I started as an advisory board member just over 2 years ago with Plus, we were about 20 people. We're now at about 135. We're continuing to grow. Take a look at our jobs board. We will be adding some pretty high power roles here in the next couple of weeks. So keep your eyes peeled if you're looking for things. What an incredible moment for everybody in the renewable, clean tech, climate tech space. But boy, we're about a third women at our company. I feel like we're doing a very good job on diversity. But I got to tell you, we just did an analysis on our gender pay gap, and we found one, and we're working to rectify it now.
Amy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. This is a really awesome opportunity to be here with you, Maria, and Lauren and Julie. So I'm Amy Dufour. I'm a general partner at Azola Ventures. Azola is an early stage climate tech fund, and our whole remit is investing primarily in deep tech companies that have the potential for large scale greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We do it with a very unique fund structure, one that combines both catalytic capital, which is structurally more patient and flexible capital, alongside more conventional venture capital. We believe that this unique approach is better matched to the risk and reward profile of early stage climate tech companies. And when I think about my own sort of journey into the climate space, it was not linear. Worked in a lot of different areas, including emerging and frontier markets, impact investing, renewables investment banking, also operations focused management consulting, but felt we need all hands on deck to solve the climate crisis and need a lot more diversity across the entire climate tech landscape. And one of the things I am very proud about our firm is that our general partnership is majority women led, which I think is pretty unique amongst climate tech VC funds. And we aspire to have a portfolio as well that, at least internally, our targets, a third of our CEOs identify as women or people of color, and at least a third outside of Boston and the Bay Area, to also combat some of the investing that happens along the coasts. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. Lauren?
Thanks, Maria, and great to be here. My name is Lauren Dencham. I lead Impact and ESG at Energize Ventures. Energize invest in software companies who are accelerating the energy transition by scaling existing technologies like solar, wind, electric vehicles, and things like the carbon markets. We're based in Chicago. We have around $1.2 billion of assets under management. And my role at Energize is to develop impact and ESG strategies, including DEI, for our fund, but also to act as an in-house consultant for our portfolio companies to help them embed these concepts into them from an early stage as they're building their companies. So at Energize, we're proud to say that we are prioritizing these topics in our own operations. I think with a recent hire, we have gender parity in our investment team, which is not common for our space, but still definitely have work to do, and have been continuing to build our pipeline to make sure that we're funding companies from women-led and underrepresented founders. So prior to joining Energize, I was at KPMG for 13 years, supporting clients with ESG and sustainability strategies. So it's been fun trying to adapt those strategies to early stage in the venture space. And I'm also a mom of 2 kids under 5, so have that lens to my work as well. But great to be here.
Absolutely. And before we start talking about some of the challenges around diversity and gender diversity in particular, I do want to talk about what's happening in the labor force more broadly. I think a lot of us have been paying attention to what's been going on since late last year, with so many tech companies doing layoffs and a market slowdown in funding as well. I'm curious to hear how you all are thinking about these macro trends and what do they mean for climate tech specifically. Amy, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. I think one of the really incredible things about being in the climate tech space, particularly right now, is it is having a moment, and so many people want to rightfully get into the space. And there's so many different ways that people can learn their skills, whether it's at an investing firm or a startup or at a large corporate that now has a new climate strategy. One of the interesting things about the tech layoffs, which is, it's really, traumatic and tragic in one ways for the people that have lost their jobs. But on the flip side, across many climate tech organizations, it's really an opportunity to absorb people that have complementary skill sets that might not have come top of mind. So in my space in particular, we're primarily investing in really early stage hard tech climate companies, physical innovations in science and engineering. And that usually comes with someone who has a very deeply kind of technical background, a PhD or a postdoc. And some of the layoffs that have happened across the tech sector kind of lead to other areas that are just as critical for startup growth, but might not have been kind of the first hire that some of these deep tech founders would have thought of. So it's a really, really great opportunity. And I think that if climate tech companies and firms more broadly are smart about it, they can really leverage this moment to bring in a whole new group of talent.
I'm happy to report that we pounced actually over the last few months and brought in some senior folks as advisors at Plus to our data platform team, which has been growing dramatically. We're now up to about 25 people, and we were 18 months ago. And one of the things they're doing, they do not come from an energy background. It's incredibly important to have energy-oriented people because we're literally figuring out the brain power on how to optimize safety, performance, and profitability for our facilities. But what they bring is structural thinking to how to solve fast software engineering and machine learning problems. One of the advisors we brought in was from GoDaddy, another one's from Facebook. I don't know that we would have that talent opportunity at hand, but for the current climate, not climate, but the current economic climate of the tech sector. And so I do believe that the diaspora of knowledge from the Silicon Valley notional space propagating into the Climatetech space is going to be net a gigantic positive for everybody.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, we, even before the recent tech layoffs, we were getting emails from people who worked in traditional tech sectors saying, I want to do something more purpose-oriented. I feel a calling to use my skills towards this challenge. Do you have any recommendations? And I think that's only increased since all of these layoffs have been happening. So it might be an impetus for somebody that might have needed a kick to make that jump, albeit maybe a bit of a brutal one. But there's a number of initiatives in place, like the climate draft and other kind of organizations that are looking to bring people from sectors outside of climate into this space, because I think, as others have mentioned, we need all of the talent that we can get to solve these challenges.
Definitely. And I think you all touched a little bit on this, but there's a big misconception that to work in climate means to have deep technical expertise or technical backgrounds, when in reality, these companies are massive and they need HR professionals and salespeople and people from across different talents and backgrounds to help them run and scale. I'd love to hear from you if you've laid out a little bit of this, but what is the value proposition for working in climate right now? I think the purpose-driven work is a huge part of that, but how are you thinking about selling a career in climate at this moment?
I don't feel like we have to sell.
Yeah.
We have a wave of people looking to move, and that's been true for a long time now. I was a executive in residence in a graduate business program in Denver. And at the time, it was mostly oil and gas folks that were in that program with a couple of renewable folks. And the oil and gas guys at first were kind of like, who is she and why is she here? Like, shouldn't we be talking to an oil and gas executive? And then they started listening to me and thinking about the fact that they'd already been laid off during 2 different cycles. And they would come up to me after class and say like, so you're telling me that you guys have like a 30 or 40 year growth run? I was like, definitely. Where do I sign up? So that I think there are definitely people who come at it from an impact and personal morality perspective, and there's other folks that look at it purely economically. How do I provide a life for myself and my family in those cases that I can see a consistent future to?
Yeah, I think there's a big case to be made for this is the direction that the market is moving. This is, the future of where dollars are being invested, and initiatives like the IRA have given, a huge boon in terms of certainty and planning horizons for renewable energy projects that wasn't there before. So I think in terms of job security and training, it's not a bad place to put your bets in terms of your career. So I think being able to marry kind of purpose with an economic opportunity is something that's relatively, it's not a hard sell.
One other thing I was going to add is that there are a lot of people too, outside of the morality piece and the economic opportunity, that just love to work on big thorny problems. And like, this is one of the biggest problems of our time that requires real solutions, real innovation, and we're on a ticking time clock. And so I think there's also a couple of these like adrenaline, junkies out there who just love to, get into solving big complex problems. And climate is an amazing opportunity to do that because we need all hands on deck.
Absolutely. And so, getting at the issue of gender diversity or the lack thereof in the industry, gender parity in the workforce has long been a problem. It's one that persists today. So, I want to bring in a few numbers to anchor our discussion moving forward. Of the over 3,000 companies that have gone public in the US since 2013, less than 1% have been founded and led by women at the time of going public. Women-founded startups raised only 1.9% of all VC funds in 2022, and that was a drop from 2021. In the US, women make up only 30% of the workforce in solar and wind, and that's compared to 47% of the overall workforce. And globally, women make up just 30% of researchers. Another interesting fact that I found is that despite making up that 47% of the national workforce, women make up just 13.8% of participants in apprenticeship programs, which we know can be a funnel to job opportunities. So with all this in mind, and when it comes to diversity and inclusion, what has been your experience with gender disparity in this field? And Lauren, maybe we can start us, you can start us off.
Yeah, I think particularly in venture and in early stage venture or early stage climate tech, which is being funded by venture, I think that the challenge is that this has been a historically network driven business. And because the people's networks tend to look like them, and because the gender disparities that have existed historically, it's a really hard nut to crack in terms of really making a change. I think that from our perspective, it's really just been a matter of trying to find ways to disrupt those traditional processes for how we find companies, for trying to find companies that might be outside our traditional network or the existing network of our partners, or trying to encourage our portfolio companies, not just to, hire the guy that you went to Stanford with and try to open up the search more, because it will actually add value to your company in the long term. So I think the kind of very relationship-based nature of a lot of these businesses presents a really hard challenge to overcome. But it's just a matter of trying to disrupt some of those knee-jerk processes with processes that are more intentional and value-adding over the long term. It's something we've been trying really hard to help our portfolio companies with, and kind of provide them with tools and networks and suggestions for how they can expand what they've historically gone to for finding companies and finding top talent to place in their companies.
Yeah, I think on the investing side, it's very interesting. I agree with everything that Lauren just mentioned. From a deep tech climate perspective, I think it's also incumbent upon us to change who and what we value in terms of a typical founder. So, in the space that I play in, usually somebody who has a PhD from a STEM discipline is, considered, kind of the creme de la creme. And in the United States, that's already going to be kind of closing and narrowing the funnel, because, many of the people, the overwhelming majority of people who will have that profile, may not be diverse in all of the dimensions that we're looking for. So I think it's also about broadening our mind in terms of what makes a credible founder in the space, what credentials do they need to have or don't need to have, and making sure that we're not kind of inadvertently closing off a whole segment of the population because of what we think is necessary to be able to understand a pretty heavy science or engineering focused company.
Here. Let me give a shout out to the team at New Energy Nexus. I am their board chair, and they provide early stage seed funding, support, and acceleration in a network around the world. We have CalSeed and CalTestBed in California and the Clean Fight in New York, both of which are publicly funded. And we have essentially focus and effectively quotas for our efforts on gender and other diversity in the founders and early stage companies that we support. They are doing a phenomenal job. And if you want to be inspired, just check out the most recent impact report. It is so impressive. Danny Kennedy, who leads that team, has done a cool podcast on Amazon you can listen to. If you want to feel inspired globally, take a look at what they're doing. But it's a plan. That is not accidental. And I do have to say that I think I didn't used to be as much of a quota person. And then there was the renewable portfolio standard, and that turned out okay. And then we had California decide, women on boards. And then the NASDAQ was kind of like, yeah, that's a good idea. We should do that. And lo and behold, you know what happened? I started getting board calls. It's the most remarkable thing. So I do think, I think we are in a much, much, much different place than we were when I was in college, when I was literally the only woman in the room in my engineering classes. Most of the time there was no female faculty and not a single female administrator in my engineering program. Wow, 25 years later, it was more than half women in that program, same school. So it is evolving in a very positive way. It doesn't mean we're done yet, either on parity or on our journey for climate mitigation. But I do think we need to celebrate the successes along the way and tell great stories that inspire others. New Energy Nexus does a great job of that.
Definitely. And I think that you bring in such an important point, which is the progress and the intentionality behind why there has been progress. This is going to be a bit of an obvious question to some, but I do really want to hear what your experience has been and your thoughts specifically from where you work. Why is this important? Why are we still talking about it? And why should we strive for a workforce that looks like the world that we live in?
Better ideas.
I would double down on that. It's better ideas that will have different points of views and that will be able to be stress tested in different ways because you'll have different vantage points. I fundamentally believe that diversity is critical for everything that we do, but especially in the climate crisis when we don't have time, it's like, why would you be like intentionally excluding people, or maybe not even intentionally, but why would you be excluding people from having a seat at the table and contributing their ideas, knowing that we know we need more ideas around not only innovation, but acceleration and deployment? That seems to me like a missed opportunity, and one that's even more acute in the space that we're all operating in.
Yeah, I think better ideas and better performance. It's been proven that companies that have more diverse leadership and more diverse boards tend to make better decisions. And I think it's, partially just a effect of having different viewpoints and lived experiences in the room. Like, I can't tell you how many times that somebody with a different lived experience than me has said something that said, God, I've never thought of that. I never would have had that thought. And you can't have those light bulb moments and opportunities to serve new customers or enter new markets or change the way that you're doing things if you have everybody in the room that thinks about problems in the same way and that comes to the room with the same experience. So I think those are key aspects here.
So with all that being said, I want to get at some of the barriers that still persist. From your experiences and your careers, where do you think are still like the touch points or the friction that happens to keep women in the workplace? Because I think one aspect is hiring and having diverse hiring practices. A whole other aspect is keeping people happy and fulfilled once they are in those roles. So what do you see as barriers in that aspect?
Ooh, I have some strong feelings about this. One is the environments that women are coming into. If they're not inclusive, if you've always had a team of all men and you've made comments or, even, created events like team events that just aren't inclusive for women, like that's already creates an environment where someone doesn't feel like they can bring their whole selves to work, where they can't be authentic. I think that's, one really critical piece. I think another piece too for women, and I'll also like extrapolate this more broadly into people of color, is coming into an organization and not feeling as though there are very clear milestones or a clear pathway in terms of development. So to your point, Maria, hiring is, one point. Recruiting, I think in some ways it's hard, but the harder part is actually retaining talent, especially in a place where there are less, women engineers or like insert X type of job. There's going to be 5 or 10 other firms that are going to be competing for that talent. And if you don't have a thoughtful way to explain what career progression looks like and give, constant feedback on terms of whether things that need to be done better or positive reinforcement, like that person is also likely to look elsewhere. So I think both about creating an inclusive environment and then also, doing what you can by allowing people to understand that they have a place in your organization and at different levels will do so much. I also think burnout is another thing, but I'll stop there. So I'm sure Lauren and Julie have other things to add.
Yeah, and I can speak a little bit to burnout and also parenting. I think that a reason that a lot of women have left the workforce, particularly after the pandemic, was they just got completely burnt out because they lost their support systems. And I think a key aspect of this that isn't always discussed is kind of the other side of the coin, which is are you providing space for men to also step up to be there for their families? Because if you're only providing space for women to do that, then that it's an accommodation for a woman when actually everybody having equal parental leave, having equal opportunities to have a life outside of work, I think creates a space where it's not just you're trying to accommodate somebody who is more likely to be taking on more than their fair share of responsibilities at home. Maybe you should also be helping out more at home if you are not a woman. So I think examining those relationships and things like equal parental leave is really important. And I think that's something that I always look for when, evaluating a company and whether or not that might be a place where you'd like to work is, what are the men doing and how do they talk about their lives? And is this a place where I can see myself in this leadership team, even if there might not be other women there, but shared values around family, I think are really important, particularly for working parents.
I'm going to give an example of at a past company where I worked with, we had a lot of babies all of a sudden. It's always sort of good news when you have a bunch of babies born, because what that means is people think that you've got a stable business. So as somebody who's in a growth environment, I love seeing babies born, got to plan around them. It was interesting because what I found at the time was that the notion of what leave looked like for parents was very specific to their situation. And I certainly have my own experience with both of my kids there, but it was fascinating because people assumed that there was a very defined plan, and that was the plan, and that's all there could be. But we were a little company. We're less than 100 people. There's no such thing as like a defined plan. It's all like figuring it out different quarter to quarter. And so we worked with one woman, and it was fascinating talking to her because I wouldn't have thought she would want to do it this way, but she did. She wanted to be 2 days full time. She wanted to have 100% brain focused on work 2 days a week, not part time 4 days a week, 2 days a week, full time, 3 days not. Her role was, we were able to shape her role to make that work. Talked to a dad had a totally different perspective on it. He wanted a couple weeks off, and then he wanted Fridays off over the course of the summer. Okay, like that's fine. There's many different ways to shape what it looks like to accommodate people's changes in family dynamics. In some cases, it's parents, not kids. But I think that the notion, one of the gifts from the pandemic, among all the chaos and trauma, is that we've demonstrated that there's many, many ways to operate, particularly with remote work. And we are trying at Plus to really live a remote company with a remote culture. We do have about a dozen people sitting in a Houston office part of their time. But the vast majority of us are all over the country and now into Canada. And that requires purpose too, but it also provides people with this sense of freedom that I don't know that we have very many folks that have said yes to our culture who would be willing to go back to 100% office environment. And I think that's unbelievably important data for anybody, any recruiter trying to recruit out of our company.
Definitely. And I think one thing we all were chatting about is post-pandemic and the fact that remote or flexible first workplaces have become the norm. And that can be like very, very helpful to some people in accommodating lifestyles and life outside of work. But at the same time, we have seen very, very high levels of burnout, especially in women. And so, Amy, going back to what you were mentioning before, I'm curious to hear from all of you, how do you think companies or workplaces can support people going through burnout, or better yet, prevent it from getting to a point where it has to be, I need to step back and leave?
Sure. I mean, it's a really, really great question. And I think I'll focus on the preventative aspects, or at least one thing, which I think has been pretty challenging throughout the pandemic, is kind of moving things forward or outlining things with a sense of false urgency. You know, we all are working in very busy work environments, and it's really important to be quite clear on when something is actually urgent, when there is an external party that is dependent on it, or, you know, you could have a huge kind of impact to the quality or cost of something, like if something isn't done at a certain time scale. But frankly, there's a lot of, you know, I want this done now. Why? Because I just want it done now. And then somebody's going to sit on it for another week. And I think especially during the pandemic, when we haven't had this separation from work and home because people are often working in their homes, that like sense of false urgency can feel, you know, I'll speak personally, can sometimes feel even more frustrating, because you're like, I'm, you know, at my house and it is the evening time and I thought I was supposed to be doing something, but so-and-so needs something now because I don't really have full context. And I think being really mindful of that, particularly amongst some of the younger generation that's coming in, because they're not standing for a lot of, Gen Z is not standing for a lot of things that the rest of us were willing to take. And I think it's a really important moment for everyone across the climate industry and just industry more broadly to think, are our ways of working the best route to getting what we need out of our employees, and also for them to be happy and healthy and want to do their best work? I think, you know, the answer probably will be no if we just keep, you know, bulldozing down a path that leads more people to burnout, because people will quit earlier. You know, I think the thought was in certain industries, especially, you know, I used to be a renewables investment banker, is it's okay if people burn out because in a year or two, we'll have someone else on the hamster wheel and like we'll replenish them. But that's going to happen much more quickly. And that's not an effective way to build an organization.
You're here. So one of the things that we do, I'm pretty militant about making sure that people get their weekends. And so we actually had an example last weekend. My husband isn't here this week. It was our Valentine's time together last weekend. And there was somebody who, in all good intention, sent out a mass Slack on an issue that was kind of a hot topic. And people jumped on it because it's a Saturday Slack to a mass group of people. It must be unbelievably urgent. It wasn't, and in fact, it was counterproductive that way. And we had a good conversation about that, and everybody's good. But the notion of the sanctity of real time, where you are not expected to be in response. I make it a point, if I send out an evening Slack or email or something, I say either non-urgent or tomorrow, please. This is not a request for an overnight event. We have what is a climate crisis that we are all working on pieces of. That is a 100-mile marathon. there'll be periods where people are really doing the 100-hour week thing. They aren't doing that for 20 years. There's no way. I didn't do it for 20 years. I took breaks. You've got to decide how to live your life. Some people will go more intensity with breaks. Other people will go for something that looks more like part-time to full-time to slightly over full-time for a longer period of time. That's okay. But company culture does make a difference. And one of the things I'm intentional about, along with our leadership team, is weekends are yours.
I agree with that fully. I think, I agree with everything that's been said so far. The only things that I would add would just be kind of keeping tabs on, what the unpromotable tasks are that women are taking on and what they feel comfortable delegating to others versus are trying to do themselves. I think women are more likely than men to just try to do everything and to try to be helpful. And I think that can lead really quickly to burnout that doesn't need to happen. And I think also the point that you'd made, Julie, earlier about pay equity, pay women fairly. Like it's that simple. It's a lot easier to feel burnt out if you're just like, this isn't worth it. I'm not being paid enough. I've been there personally. And you're like, you say that it's because I'm burnt out, but at the same time, it's just like, you're just not paying me to work this hard. So I think doing pay equity audits and also audits of what the tasks are that people are undertaking and making sure that those kind of housekeeping tasks in the office are equally distributed is also really important.
So I think this is a great time to bring in a question from the chat that relates to what we've been talking about. And it is that a lot of the companies or organizations that we are talking about are emerging. They're small, either deep tech or other climate tech startups. And in that startup environment where they're resource constrained and you have a ton of work to do, and when you are able to make a new hire, you might be more willing or just unconsciously to say this role needs to be filled now versus have the capacity and the resources to go out and do the networking and hiring someone to do this kind of inclusive hiring. But then that perpetuates like the founding culture of the company becoming that. And Lauren, what you said, calling up your Stanford buddies and like hiring that way because it's faster. In your experience with the companies that you've worked in, how have they been able to avoid that kind of slippery slope of like what's ECS now versus investing in a future that creates this inclusive culture?
Yeah, I think it's not an easy challenge to solve when speed always seems to be of the essence. I think having certain processes in place that you commit to following kind of can prevent that from happening. I think the other thing that we've been trying to get from our portfolio companies is understand what are the kind of easier things that you can do now. For example, if you have women or underrepresented groups within your company, have them repost a role to their network or highlight them as success stories within your company so that people can see themselves working there. So I think there's things that you can do to increase the visibility of job postings beyond traditional networks, or just doing quick outreach. These things don't take that long to try to do outreach to and do a quick Google of job boards or informal groups on Slack like Tech Area or Hire Black or whatever it might be. There are many, and that in itself is overwhelming. But if you're intentional about the type of talent that you need and have some resources that you can go to just to try to diversify the top of the funnel. I think this is what we try to encourage our companies to do, and what we try to practice ourselves is you don't close the role until there is sufficient diversity in that pipeline for that role. So do what you can to get enough representation within that pipeline before you can close a role, and maybe set a goal for yourself on what that looks like for your company. And it might take a little bit longer, but it probably won't take as long as you think it would, especially once you get into the habit of doing it.
I think that's totally true. I'll just give a shout out to my husband's company, H-Cycle, totally in that role. They're going from like 5 to 10 sort of right now. And basically the answer is, I will not look at a group of candidates without a series of diversity elements within the candidate pool. It's just a fact. So that just changes the conversation from the start.
Yeah, I also think that the kind of speed and quality, I think that sometimes too people will say, oh, the quality, won't be as good if we make it broader. And all the research, I think, Lauren, that you quoted earlier, that's come out about performance. I mean, people should really be focused on that. And there are also some easier, like quick wins. Sometimes what I say is, if it feels overwhelming to go out and spend a ton of time recruiting for a chief commercialization officer, and we want that person to be a woman. Okay, let's start small. There are a million, maybe not a million, but there are tons of really hungry grad students that are looking for internships. Why don't we start with that? Like, let's put something out, a job description, and let's practice the process that, has been described with appropriate diversity targets with an internship role. Let's look at that for a chief of staff. Let's look at that for engineers. And then when you think about broader engineers, are you going to the Society of Women Engineers? Are you speaking to the National Society of Black Engineers? Like, are you making your presence known in some of these groups? Because many of them have job boards that you as a company, you would have to, to pay for, but oftentimes they're willing to waive certain fees, particularly if they think this relationship is going to be long-term for maybe the first or second posting. And then if you have success, you pay like a full rate. But I think people don't want to do the extra work, and also don't sometimes realize they can start out small for something that seems less high stakes. And it's even hard for me to say that because I'm like, you should really just start out with a C-suite and diversify that immediately. But I have to meet people where they're at sometimes. And, being so overwhelmed or feeling like it's too hard is not an excuse. You can start small and then really build up to it, have the processes. So then it just becomes second nature. Okay, yeah, I'm not looking at any of these candidates until, at least a third or half of the group are diverse candidates, or whatever metric, people want to use.
And the other thing to just highlight is that if you're using a recruiter for a specific role, you can ask this of them. You just have to ask. They will do most of the recruiters now will do kind of a diversity-led search where they make an effort to completely fill the pipeline with diverse candidates and only backfill if needed. And you can push them on it. I think it's kind of, we've had examples where our board members have had a recruiter come back and present a slate of all white male candidates. And it's like, no, try again. You didn't try hard enough. And so you can push back on recruiters too.
So going back to some of these more systemic levers for change, Julie, you mentioned earlier boards and some of the pay transparency laws that just went into effect in California and Washington State, as well as pay equity audits. I'm curious how you all are thinking about these more either legal or regulation level changes and how they're already impact you, and is there any pushback? And if so, where is that pushback coming from? Julie, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. I think pushback comes from defensiveness because people do not want to hear that they are not fair. I mean, they probably were not thinking, I know I'm going to pay a woman or somebody else less than everybody else. Very unlikely that's actually what went through their head. What went through their head is, a little less experience, doesn't look quite like the person I knew 2 jobs ago, so maybe just 25K less or something like that, That's not the best way to start the conversation is probably not, look how poorly you've done. Although I'll admit, sometimes that is the thought that's running through my mind. So, I sit as the comp chair of 2 companies on the board of American Battery Technology Company, super cool little company, check them out, and Zinc 5, also a cool company, both in the battery lithium recycling space. I underestimated how important, I didn't think it wasn't going to be important being comp committee chair. It seemed like a good idea. I cared deeply about pay equity issues. But the power of the comp committee is that sets the goals by which executives get their bonus and incremental equity allocations. It is literally the gatekeeper to incremental valuation gains for their personal life. That's a pretty powerful position. I think if we were able to put women in comp committee positions across the country overnight, the world would be a very different place. So I hope that one of the things that people will think about as you advance in your careers is if you're willing to serve on boards, and let me tell you, it is a serious workload. Do not think that it is retirement fun on the beach. It is retirement, be on the phone today for today's emergency. Nevertheless, there is huge value to be able to contribute, particularly if you're an operating executive. Boy, if you're an operating executive, get thyself onto a company board, because you get a lot of folks that are professional investors. They have things to offer. They do not have operating company experience, and therefore they are not the right people to set metrics for comp committee purposes. So I'm a fan of thinking about how we inject women into board positions for governance, for comp, for sure for audit. But the places to make the difference may be a little different than you think at first glance.
Yeah, I think there's a number of avenues or a number of stakeholders, I guess, that can push companies to drive progress. Regulation is one. A company's board is another really powerful one. And I think one of the things that I've been surprised about is kind of just asking the question is sometimes a really just good place to start. And, to Julie's point, not necessarily like, look how bad you've done, but just like, could you show me that data? Can we talk about it? Let's see how we're doing. So I think, starting the conversation is just so that the company knows that you're thinking about it, is incredibly powerful. And one of the things I've been really, when we've been issuing our ESG requests to our portfolio companies, I've been very conscious of trying to keep it light and trying to make it not overly burdensome for our portfolio companies. That said, I've had at least 3 of them say, thank you for asking for this information. You've given me leverage to drive this initiative within my company, because now I can say that our investor is tracking this information and that they care about it. So me just asking for the information has given somebody within that organization a bit of leverage, which I think can be, more powerful than at least I initially had envisioned.
One other thing too, that you mentioned, Lauren, really kind of is sparking some pieces, is not only that happening once you've made an investment into a company, but even during your investment decision-making process. So to give an example from my firm is, we at Azola have a dedicated diversity, equity, and inclusion session with any founder that we are very serious about making an investment in. And it's always sort of co-led by one of the general partners and whoever's on our diligence team, because we also don't want it to seem like this is a throwaway thing that somebody who's very senior doesn't care about. And the point is there aren't any right or wrong answers, but we ask them a series of questions about how they're thinking about DEI, sort of pay equity being one of them. And the purpose is really to gauge, like, how open are they to making some of the changes and some of the hard choices that will need to be made to prioritize, DEI. And they don't need to have all of the answers, but a willingness to engage with the topic and understanding that if they choose to partner with us at Azola, it's something that we care deeply about. And we don't have the answers either. All of the answers, I want to say we're very humble in our own journey, as I think anyone should be. But we'll work with them together so that way we can try and figure it out. And that's, become an important step even before we get to investment committee, which is somebody gives a readout on that dedicated DEI session to our investment team. And, there's follow-up, in case, people weren't satisfied, with kind of the thoughts that have been brought across, or people had follow-up questions. And there's a range, there, some companies that have like a whole, DEI plan at different stages of their growth that they have targets that they want to hit. And, some of their founders, this is like the first, not completely the first time they've thought about it, but they're really interested and have some, initial ideas. And those are both absolutely fine. We just want to make sure that there's a willingness to engage and an understanding that, we will come back and ask those questions, I think, Lauren, to your initial point, after we make an investment.
So we have a couple questions in the chat, one from someone currently studying computer science in college, and another about the kind of STEM pipelines of folks still in pursuing an education. I'm curious how you all are thinking that. That's definitely an area. STEM is still very, very male dominated across higher education. And as you said, Amy, there are some opportunities in this field that require technical degrees. So what would your advice be to anyone pursuing a technical degree right now that is hoping to get into climate in their career?
Read Canary media. And I'm not really kidding about that. I realize that if you're a really focused technology person, you can miss the bigger picture. Where are markets going and why? What are the economic consequences? What just happened over in Europe that was some third order effect of the war in Ukraine? Those things put everything you're doing in context and radically improve your ability to have conversations with whether it's your next supervisor, your investor, your colleague down the hall in marketing. Staying up to date, whether it's a newsletter or reading your daily updates. I often tell students in college, they have to pick a couple of things, read them daily. Like it's the equivalent of going to the gym.
No, I think it's a great point. It's being kind of broad and holistic about your understanding of the climate crisis. I was going to say definitely Canary. I have like a couple, there are like 3 or 4 newsletters that I read every day or if they come out weekly, and it's like, I'm religious about it. And I think it's important too, because even though I'm an investor and I focus a lot on kind of breakthrough technology companies, there's a wide array because I'm not a policy expert, even though that has a really big role in the success, of our company. So I, try to read something on that. I actually try to read something in the philanthropy space because maybe there is an aspect of a business that could, instead of being de-risked with equity capital, which is often very expensive, there could be non-dilutive funding or programs. So I think just more broadly, taking a step back and making sure that you are reading things that are from different sources and that are complementary to your core skill set is also can be very, very helpful. I was going to say too that there are a lot of, particularly if you are a woman and have a STEM background, there are a number of different programs that, and I'll speak from the investing space, that investors are kind of looking for people at different universities to either serve as, scouts for potential investment opportunities, or frankly, as a way to get smarter on a particular technology or subject matter area. They usually end up getting clued in with, particular professors or research centers. But, I would also definitely go to, if you are at school and you have like an entrepreneurship center, and sort of making your presence and your desire to get into this space known, because at least at our firm, we, reach out to, a certain number of universities, like entrepreneurship centers, professors who we like considered nodes within the space. And sometimes we'll say, hey, give us everybody, but we're especially interested because, it's underrepresented, like female founders or founders of color. And that can also be a pretty, easy way to make sure you get on somebody's radar. I know that's amorphous because sometimes it's like, who are the nodes within a university, but, it's just something to look out for.
Agreed. The only other thing I would add would be, just get involved. I think that there are so many ways that just, as a student or a citizen, that you can get involved in the climate movement by starting an initiative at your university, by becoming part of an, activist group, by volunteering at a local nonprofit. Board service is one of, I think the most nonprofit board service is one of, I think, the most underrepresented ways to get, experience in a specific area, or, an advisory board or junior advisory board if you are a student. So I think there's a lot of ways just to start working in this space before you start working if you're at university, or if you're trying to transition, to just start somewhere, start an initiative at your company, or offer a hand to somebody that's doing that. That will already give you a heads up or a head start towards someone that hasn't done those things and is trying to get into the same space.
Definitely. And maybe like going off of that, in terms of the bigger industry or the trends that you're seeing, either what are some of the most exciting opportunities for job growth that you're seeing, or where are the gaps? Where do we need to hire a lot of people and there maybe aren't enough?
I can start. So I refer people to our Energize job board. We have over 200 jobs on there now. I think, the climate crisis needs people from every background, as you alluded to at the beginning of the session, Maria. So, we need accountants for climate, strategists for climate, HR professionals for climate. And, it's just a lens on a number of existing skill sets. So I think within our portfolio, we are, because we invest in software companies, software engineers, sales leaders are big needs. And I think that, more broadly, I think one of the things that we've been looking at potential companies to invest in is trying to address the gap in the trades. We'll need people to put these assets in the ground to service them. And those are, good paying jobs that don't always require a college degree. So that's just another thing to highlight in terms of gaps in skill sets now.
Yeah, I'll give to that point, I'll give a shout out to Camille Terry, who's just phenomenal at Charger Help, who's, everybody knows Camille, she's amazing. In my former space of charging now, I'm going to store the energy so we can charge in the evening. So it is a great opportunity moment to deploy. We are going to build gigantic quantities of renewable energy storage, electric vehicles, their charging stations. We're at a moment of mass transformation, and we are committed, thanks to the IRA, to actually manufacturing the things in the United States, or potentially some of our partners. We may even we're testing if we're going to be committed to doing things like mining lithium in the United States. We may actually get there. Big test case coming up this spring. So that means that we're going to end up putting jobs in places that haven't seen them for a while. The one, I'll give you a very specific example. In the IRA investment tax credit for stationary storage, which did not exist unless it was paired with renewables before, there is a specific extra adder if you're in what's called an energy community, which basically means someplace that used to have a dirty old plant that we'd like to replace with something clean. It absolutely, that is a piece of policy that has dramatically and overnight changed where things will get built. It doesn't mean that we will never build another energy community, but when we have two options in roughly the same zone, we're going energy community now, which means there's opportunities for cleanup, jobs, improved infrastructure, all kinds of benefits that will be driven in. That is a policy decision. That is not an economic decision. It's an economic consequence of a policy decision. Policy does rule markets.
I don't think I have anything else to add to what Lauren and Julie put in there, but yeah, we need everyone. So please don't see that there's not a space for you. And sometimes too, some of the hardest and like thorniest problems, in climate really require a fresh perspective because people have been going down the same, route for so long. And we need different types of people that are at the table. So we do not have a jobs board, but I always say I host, an office hours session once a month, because I would get so many people, a lot of women and people of color reaching out saying, how do I get into climate, to just consolidate and talk about career transition. So, that's always available. Find me on LinkedIn. But I know we're almost at time, Maria.
We are almost at time. I could speak to all of you for many more hours, but I know your time is limited. I am so grateful for your time today. Please make sure to check out all of their interviews in Charging Up and so many others. Follow them on LinkedIn and the platforms that you all mentioned for job growth. I'm super excited to keep covering this topic. And yeah, go to canarymedia.com.
Thank you, Maria.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Maria.
Bye.